It didn't begin with a single shot at Fort Sumter. It began decades earlier with a quiet, growing question that no one in America could agree on. What kind of country was this supposed to be? Was it a nation built on freedom for everyone, or a republic that allowed human bondage to exist so long as it kept the Union together? By 1861, that question had become impossible to ignore, and when it finally erupted into war, it wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of tension, compromise, fear, and a deep, irreconcilable divide over slavery. In the early years of the United States, many believed slavery would simply fade away. Some of the founders even called it a temporary evil, something future generations would eventually end. But history didn't move in that direction. Instead, slavery became stronger, especially in the South. In 1793, the invention of the cotton gin changed everything. Suddenly, cotton became incredibly profitable. Plantations spread across the Deep South, and with them, the demand for enslaved labor exploded. What once seemed like a declining system became the backbone of an entire regional economy. By the early 1800s, millions of enslaved people were forced to work under brutal conditions, generating enormous wealth for Southern landowners. This wasn't just an economic system, it was a way of life, a social order built on the belief that slavery was necessary, justified, even beneficial. But in the North, a very different transformation was taking place. Industry was rising, factories expanded, cities grew, and while racism still existed, slavery itself became far less central to Northern life. Gradually, Northern states began abolishing it altogether, and this created a growing divide, not just economic, but moral, political, and deeply emotional. Because every time the country expanded westward, one question followed. Would slavery expand with it, or stop? At first, leaders tried to maintain a fragile balance. In 1820, the Missouri Compromise drew a line across the map. Below it, slavery would be allowed. Above it, banned. It was meant to keep the peace, but it didn't solve the problem. It only delayed it. As the nation grew, so did the stakes. Each new state threatened to shift the balance of power in Congress, and neither side was willing to give ground. By the 1830s and 1840s, the debate had become louder and more dangerous. Abolitionists in the North began speaking out with urgency. They published newspapers, gave speeches, and demanded the immediate end of slavery. Some had lived through it themselves, sharing first-hand accounts that shocked the nation. In the South, these voices weren't just seen as criticism, they were seen as a threat. Southern leaders began defending slavery more aggressively, calling it a positive good. They argued it was essential not just to their economy, but to their entire society. And they feared something deeply, that if the federal government ever restricted slavery, their world would collapse. Out of that fear came a powerful idea: states' rights. Southern politicians argued that each state should decide its own laws, including slavery. But in reality, this argument centered on one thing: protecting slavery from interference. The tension exploded in the 1850s. After gaining new territories from Mexico, the same question returned, louder than ever. Would these lands be free or slave? The Compromise of 1850 tried to settle it. California entered as a free state, but the deal came with a price: a strict Fugitive Slave Act. Even in free states, citizens were now required to help capture escaped enslaved people. This outraged the North. It forced people to confront slavery directly, whether they wanted to or not. Then came one of the most explosive laws in American history, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Instead of drawing a line, it allowed settlers to decide for themselves: popular sovereignty. In theory, it sounded fair. In reality, it led to chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed into Kansas, each trying to control the outcome. Violence broke out, towns burned, lives were lost. It became known as Bleeding Kansas, a warning of what was coming. At the same time, the political system began to collapse. Old parties fell apart, new ones emerged. In the North, the Republican Party rose, built on stopping the expansion of slavery. In the South, that alone felt like a direct threat. Then in 1857, the Supreme Court made a decision that shocked the nation. In the Dred Scott case, it ruled that African Americans were not citizens. They had no rights under the Constitution, and Congress had no power to limit slavery in the territories. For many in the North, this confirmed their worst fears. Slavery wasn't just surviving, it was spreading. By the late 1850s, the country wasn't just divided politically, it was divided emotionally. Families split, communities fractured, trust disappeared. In 1859, an abolitionist named John Brown took a radical step. He led a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, hoping to spark a slave uprising. It failed. He was captured and executed. But the reaction said everything. In the North, some saw him as a hero. In the South, he was proof that violence was coming. Fear turned into something deeper, a belief that coexistence might no longer be possible. And then came the election of 1860. A relatively unknown politician from Illinois ran for president. He didn't call for immediate abolition, but he opposed the expansion of slavery, and when he won, everything changed. For the first time, a president had been elected without support from the South. To many Southerners, that meant one thing: they had lost control. Their future and the future of slavery was now in danger. Within weeks, states began to leave the Union. They didn't hide why. In their own words, they made it clear. They were leaving to protect slavery. By early 1861, the United States had split in two, and when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, the war had already been decades in the making. So what was the real reason the Civil War started? Not a single event, not a misunderstanding, and not just states' rights on their own. At its core, it was about slavery, its expansion, its protection, and its future in America. Everything else, politics, compromises, violence, revolved around that one issue. One side believed slavery was wrong and had to stop. The other believed it was essential and had to survive. And in the end, there was no middle ground left. The war wasn't inevitable at the beginning, but with each passing decade, the chances of avoiding it grew smaller, until finally, the question that had haunted the nation for generations had to be answered by force. What kind of country would this be? The Civil War would decide.